The problem, however, is my real problem, which is, what about these networks themselves? Do they get jammed? Do people within the network feel that someone within the network is cheating them? Do they then try to work out individual ways of coping with the problem, having rules and clubs to say you can behave this way and you cannot? Do those build up as case laws to prevent the network from doing its full function? That has always been, I think, the real problem of managed anarchy. And managed anarchy it must be, because I don't think we simply don't have the speed at which, we are looking at things over a long history and we're looking into the future. We are playing with entropy, but it is still a very managed system. Whatever you are talking about, it works within bounds, and these bounds are things which we all subscribe to. And we are pushing it in one direction, and some people are trying to actually push it in some others. I think the issue, taking off, just getting back to, I think, where Probir wanted me to talk about. I think Probir is looking very silly for me, for looking at me thinking I'm silly to talk about all of these things, is what can governments do? I think that's the last point I want to come to in this particular situation. Now in the last 6 years in which I've been in government, luckily for me I've not been in government for very long, there have been two things which have surprised me most. On both, I had predicted that these would not be greatly successful, and on both, I was totally proven wrong. One is the cell phone. I had actually not thought that the cell phone would grow to the proportions that it did in India, even 6 or 7 years ago. Now that shows to me the power of communication. It also shows to me the value people put on communication. And it also shows that actually costs are much less than what you think they are as networks grow. The second thing, which I also thought would never happen, and I thought in India the chances of it, for very different reasons, was BT cotton. That also has sort of hugely expanded over the last 5 years. This year we'll have cotton production which is 90% BT. And what does that show as a power? Well, it shows that exactly the opposite, which is that there are certain sort of things which, if the productivity is large enough, however strong the intellectual opinion against it, if it pays and if it is powerful enough, it will spread. I think between those is our policies on technology. On BT, I am now of the firm belief that here's something where we might have all sorts of reasons to oppose GMOs of any kind. But from the point of view of the state, it is important to have as much competition in the production of GMO and a public presence in the production of GMOs, at least of that technology, rather than to take a position which ultimately can be Luddite. As far as the cell phone goes, and that is the bitstream technology goes, my problem is, yes, it's a massive eye-opener about what it can do in terms of the number of people who get hooked onto it. But let me just remind one thing. India is still not a place where you need an URL. Too many people in India are outside, which is really a combination of education, and I think the real problem there is, again, that far too quickly much of our education is becoming anything but education. Too many of our brightest minds want to learn only about those things which pay, rather than those things with which they can understand the world better. There are too many of us going into hugely limiting things. We've got specialized engineering schools, specialized medical schools, and now specialized law schools, which are the only ones which can charge high fees and people are willing to pay for them, and all of which tend to actually put a premium on keeping the knowledge and selling it to one buyer rather than exchanging it more widely. And of course, added to that is precisely because this is where the returns are high, all of these sectors are becoming overwhelmingly private education rather than public education. Public education is still there in the basic sciences, it's still there in the liberal arts, but in many of these areas, you are getting a problem right at the education end. I think government needs to correct that. But I think the real question I think governments need to ask, and I think this conference can do, because I do believe very strongly that patents as a device for solving either the public goods properties of knowledge are not a particularly good device. I don't think they've added very much to the knowledge available to mankind over time. But I also do believe that we can be, without specific advice on how to go about from the public sector end, that is not the anarchy end, not the capitalist end, but the democratic end, how we need to go about the business of laws and of public procurement policy, because that can play a huge role in terms of what do we do there with, for example, open source software. But open source is big. I mean, in software it exists, but what about BT? You still don't have open source BT. How do we increase competition, and how do we increase the ability of a lot of new guys coming in without being dumped on the head by the big ones? That's an old problem of economics, that's an old problem of policy, but I think old problems will not go away. Thanks.